Leadership has inspired conversation throughout history. Political leadership has been a subject especially controversial. Who should lead? How should one lead? Why do we need leaders? And what kind of leadership works? These questions have been hashed and rehashed, eliciting an assortment of distinctly different views. But one thing is becoming increasingly clear. None of us can afford to be cavalier about leadership. In the 21st century, the stakes are simply too high. From global insecurity and environmental challenges to age-old problems of inequity and oppression, our world groans under the weight of failed and failing leadership. In this new age, the world urgently needs a new kind of global leadership, one that is founded on universal ideals of justice, compassion, self-sacrifice, and service.
Our continent has had the misfortune of lots of coups and military dictatorships, and therefore leadership is at the core of African development.
We have to start looking all over the world, how those who come to power, how they are utilizing their power. Are they prepared to run egalitarian policies that benefit everybody in a society?
If we work together, not just looking at the interest of our countries or even our sub-regions, but the interest of the continent as a continent, interest of Africa as a people, we'll get there.
You find that within the first decade or so, the euphoria with which you gained independence quickly wears off because people do not get the jobs they want from you. The money and the services they thought independence would bring wouldn't be coming. So the soldiers stepped in thinking the disciplines of the barracks were what were needed to keep countries going. Again, for the people to get disappointed, because so soon we found that it wasn't the military discipline we needed. But meanwhile, the soldiers had come with their guns and so forth and so on, and taken power, tasted power, then they refused to go.
Indeed, if there ever was a time to revisit some fundamental leadership questions of the past and seek answers for them in the light of the unique and prevailing challenges of the present, it is now. History has taught us that the kind of political leadership we pursue can change the world for better or worse, and that choosing the right kind of political leaders can ultimately be a matter of life or death. There are few regions that demonstrate this reality quite as clearly as Africa. March 2000. The Economist magazine's brazen front page headline labels Africa the hopeless continent. At the time of its publication, wars, disease, ignorance, poverty, famine, floods had come to characterize the continent. In the 1990s, there was a global surge in Afro-pessimism. Sweeping, cynical, and callous as the Economist's label might have been, in many African countries, hopeless was exactly how Africans themselves often felt. Yet, it hadn't always been this way. Ghana, March 6th, 1957. The atmosphere was electric. The country was celebrating its emancipation from colonial rule, making it the first African country to receive independence and officially attain self-governance.
At long last, the battle has ended, and thus Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever.
There is a new African in the world. That new African is ready to fight his own battle and show that after all, the black man is capable of managing his own affairs.
The freedom of Ghana gave added impetus to other liberation movements across the continent, and a domino effect quickly saw colonial rule end in one country after another in rapid succession.
Well, we were first of all inspired politically by the achievement of independence of Ghana under the leadership of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah in 1957. So, and then more so by the process of the achievement of independence of Tanganyika then, before it became the United Republic of Tanzania. So when the TANU, under the leadership of Mwalimu Nyerere, mobilized the masses of the people of Tanzania politically, and the British colonial administration there was forced to accept the demand of the people of Tanganyika under the leadership of Mwalimu Nyerere. So that is more closer to us. I learned a lot from Mwalimu, from Kwame Nkrumah, from Gamal Abdel Nasser. These are the leaders who shape up our Pan-Africanist idea of Africa for Africans. And Africa must be ruled by the Africans. This is what we shape at us.
In 1958, just a year after independence, Ghana hosted the first All-African People's Conference from the 5th to 13th of December. The event was attended by over 300 delegates, including Kwame Nkrumah himself, Patrice Lumumba, who would be the first elected Prime Minister of the Republic of Congo, Kenneth Kaunda, soon to be the first President of Zambia, Hastings Kamuzu Banda, who would be Malawi's first President, and Holden Roberto, the founding father of Angola's National Liberation Front. The event was chaired by influential Kenyan leader Thomas Mboya.
Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
During the conference, a number of resolutions were adopted, including a resolution on imperialism and colonialism, in which it was agreed that independent African states should pursue in their international policy principles that which will expedite and accelerate the independence and sovereignty of all dependent and colonial African territories. Henceforth, the African struggle against imperialism, colonialism, and racism would prove to be the single most compelling basis for common ground among African states and peoples. In their struggle to liberate the continent, Africans would be united in an unprecedented way against a common enemy and for a common goal: freedom. Though this Pan-Africanism would wane in the years after independence, it proved strong enough to ensure the liberation of the entire continent, down to the very last country, South Africa.
South Africa must be free. This is our problem. As Africans, we've got to attend to it together, and people ready to make all sorts of sacrifices, which emphasized point about, us as Africans sharing a common destiny. Because indeed the destiny of the South African people became the destiny of the African people as a whole. So what it meant, that of course that once South Africa was liberated, it had to bear that in mind, that it also just liberated South Africa, had a responsibility to the rest of the continent.
Oh yes, Africa should be totally liberated. Apartheid should have no place on the continent of Africa. That was why at that time, with the efforts being made here in Tanzania with Mwalimu, President Kaunda and the other frontline states, we were reckoned by virtue of our commitment, our orientation, our policy. We were reckoned as a member of a frontline state, even though physically and geographically we were not in the frontline. And in the case of our policy in Southern Africa, we say, look, for as long as we allow colonization and apartheid, just because of the color of our skin, then wherever we are as human beings, we are second class. And that doesn't apply to me alone. It applies to all Nigerians. It applies to all black people. And look, and nobody will want to be seen as a second-class citizen in the world or wherever he lives.
Yet for all the hope and unity that marked the continent's liberation efforts in many countries, it didn't take long for the optimism of independence to fade and give way to disillusion, doubt, and disappointment. What had gone wrong? How had a continent of such promise, resource-rich, brimming with a populace full of a sense of hope and responsibility, fallen apart? Where exactly was the problem?
I think we should pay much more attention, not only to the elections, that they are good and democratic and fair. I have supervised in Namibia the most democratic elections in the world. I'm very proud that we managed to do that. But in many countries, elections are not fair. Then those who come to power don't run egalitarian policies. That's why I think my part of the world, the Nordic countries, have to be much more straightforward in saying, come and see how our system functions. Because you have to establish trust in any society so that people feel that they have a chance to develop their skills.
In 1976, just over a decade after the independence of Nigeria, renowned African author Chinua Achebe sought to answer a question for his own country. Why did things fall apart? His conclusion was striking in its simplicity. Rather than pointing a finger externally at former colonizers or blaming a troubled past, Achebe argued that the problem in Nigeria was ultimately much closer to home.
The trouble with Nigeria is simply and squarely a failure of leadership. There is nothing wrong with the Nigerian land, or climate, or water, or air, or anything else. The Nigerian problem is the unwillingness or inability of its leaders to rise to the responsibility, to the challenge of personal example, which are the hallmarks of true leadership.
Unfortunately, in the first few decades following independence, that trouble existed well beyond the boundaries of Nigeria. Independence-era African leaders faced many daunting challenges over which they had no control. At the time of its liberation, Africa was the poorest and least developed area in the world. Few people were trained for the task of government administration. African leaders, in the course of leading their countries after independence, became a problem in themselves, impeding rather than encouraging progress. Many soon became infatuated with the trappings of power and more concerned with amassing wealth and maintaining that power. Nobel Prize winner and economist Arthur Lewis alluded to this in 1965 when he wrote of the new West African governments of the time.
Much of what is going on in some of these countries is fully explained in terms of the normal lust of human beings for power and wealth. The stakes are high. Office carries power, prestige, and money. The power is incredible. Most West African ministers consider themselves to be above the law and are treated as such by the police. The prestige is also incredible. Men who claim to be Democrats in fact behave like emperors. They build themselves palaces, bring all traffic to a standstill when they drive, hold fancy parades, and generally demand to be treated like Egyptian pharaohs. And the money is also incredible. To be a minister is to have a lifetime's chance to make a fortune.
Motivated by greed, many leaders would soon become some of the most notorious and infamous global figures. The first few decades of African self-governance yielded leaders that were largely undemocratic, corrupt, nepotistic, and often exceedingly ruthless. Some declared themselves presidents for life. Others became adept at misusing government funds and directing money earmarked for development towards the sustenance of their own outlandishly lavish lifestyles. In many countries, leaders gained notoriety for amending constitutions at whim, organizing political assassinations, imprisoning opposition leaders or voices of dissent, and favoring their fellow kinsmen with power and prestige in exchange for loyalty. This was a practice which would serve to fuel some of the deadliest ethnically driven conflicts in the world. The trouble with Africa, it seemed, was quite simply a failure of leadership.